March 1944, and a staff sergeant with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails is staring at a wastegate regulator on a P-47 Thunderbolt at Boxted airfield in England. His name is never going to make it into the history books. The pilots get the glory, the engineers get the patents, and the mechanics get forgotten. But right now, this particular sergeant is about to change the war in ways that nobody, not even him, fully understands yet. He's the crew chief for Captain Robert Johnson's P-47, and Johnson has been complaining. Not about the usual things, bullet holes or hydraulic leaks or radios that cut out at the wrong moment. No, Johnson's complaint is more subtle and far more dangerous. At 32,000 feet, where the bombers need escort and where German fighters wait to pounce, his Thunderbolt feels sluggish. The engine pulls strong, sure, but it's not giving him everything he needs. Not quite. And in aerial combat, not quite, gets you killed. Sergeant, let's call him what his squadron mates called him, Pappy Gould. Knows engines. Grew up around them, rebuilt them, understood their personalities in ways that no engineering manual could ever capture. And he's been listening to what this particular Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp has been trying to tell him. The turbo supercharger system, that brilliant maze of ducting and valves that lets the P-47 breathe at altitudes where other fighters choke, is working exactly as designed. And that's the problem. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Republic Aviation's engineers had built the P-47 around one revolutionary idea: altitude supremacy. While German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs relied on mechanically driven superchargers that stole horsepower from the engine to compress intake air, the Thunderbolt used something different: exhaust-driven turbo supercharging. The concept was elegant. Take the waste heat screaming out of 18 cylinders at 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, channel it through steel ducting to a turbine at the rear of the fuselage, and use that spinning turbine to drive a compressor. Ram dense air back into the engine. Free power, in a sense. Energy you were literally throwing away, captured and weaponized. The system gave the P-47 a rated service ceiling of 42,000 feet, higher than any Axis fighter could operate effectively, higher than most bomber formations ever needed to fly. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, there was a gap between what the manual promised and what combat demanded. The engineers at Republic had designed the turbo supercharger system with safety margins, conservative limits. The wastegate, a valve that controlled how much exhaust gas flowed to the turbine, was regulated automatically to maintain specific boost pressures. 52 inches of 8, mercury in the intake manifold. Maybe 56 at maximum continuous power, enough to keep the engine breathing sea-level air density even at 30,000 feet. But here's what Pappy Gould understood, that the engineers sitting in climate-controlled offices in Farmingdale, New York, didn't. Combat isn't about maximum continuous power. Combat is about maximum everything, right now, or you don't come home. The regulations said 52 inches. The engine, if you listened to it, was capable of more. A lot more. The P-47's turbo supercharger wasn't one component. It was an entire breathing system, threaded through the aircraft's massive fuselage. Start at the engine. 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows, spinning at 2,700 RPM, gulping fuel and air, and converting it to 2,000 horsepower. The exhaust from those cylinders fed into collector rings, massive manifolds that gathered burning gases from each cylinder bank. From there, the exhaust flowed rearward through twin stainless steel ducts, each one thick-walled to contain 1,700-degree gases, running along the lower fuselage beneath the cockpit. At full power, those ducts glowed cherry red at their forward ends. Pilots could see them through inspection ports, pulsing with heat. The ducts converged at the turbo supercharger unit, mounted in the belly of the aircraft about halfway between the cockpit and the tail. Inside that unit, exhaust gases hit a turbine wheel, a precision-machined disc with dozens of angled blades designed to extract maximum energy from the gas flow. That turbine spun at over 21,000 RPM, faster than the engine's own crankshaft, screaming at velocities where even the slightest imbalance would tear itself apart. Connected to the turbine by a shaft was the compressor wheel. As the turbine spun, the compressor gulped outside air and squeezed it to higher pressure, but compressing air heats it. Basic thermodynamics. The air coming out of the compressor could hit 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Feed hot air into an engine, and you lose density, defeating the entire purpose. So the compressed air had to travel forward again, through more ducting, to an intercooler mounted in the belly directly under the pilot's seat. The intercooler was a heat exchanger. Compressed air from the turbo flowed through tubes surrounded by engine oil. That oil was then cooled by ram air, entering through ducts in the wing roots. It was an elegant solution to a brutal problem, cooling superheated air so the engine could extract maximum oxygen from every breath. From the intercooler, the now cooled compressed air flowed back to the carburetor, where it mixed with fuel and entered the cylinders through the intake valves. The complete loop, outside air to turbine to intercooler to engine and back out as exhaust, happened continuously at savage velocities, and controlling the entire system was the wastegate. Two of them, actually. Butterfly valves in the tarm, exhaust ducting ahead of the turbo. When the wastegate opened, exhaust bypassed the turbine and vented directly overboard. When it closed, all exhaust flow went through the turbine, spinning it faster, building more boost. The wastegate position was controlled by a regulator, a mechanical system of springs, diaphragms, and linkages that sensed manifold pressure and adjusted the valve automatically. Keep boost at 52 inches. Safe, predictable, conservative. Pappy Gould looked at that regulator and thought about pilots dying. He thought about German fighters climbing away from P-47 seconds that should have been able to chase them down. He thought about bombers getting hammered because their escorts couldn't quite get into position fast enough. And he thought about what would happen if you adjusted that regulator to let the wastegate stay closed longer, building more boost, feeding the engine denser air than Republic's engineers had ever intended. The manual was explicit. Do not adjust. Wastegate settings. Do not exceed 56 inches of manifold pressure without water injection. Do not operate above rated boost for more than 5 minutes. The warnings were printed in red. Violating them would void every warranty, break every regulation, and probably get you court-martialed if anything went wrong. But then again, nobody was going to court-martial a dead pilot. In late March of 1944, something unusual happened at Boxted. A group of men arrived from Pratt & Whitney's East Hartford factory. Not executives, not salesmen, technical representatives, engineers who'd actually designed and built the R2-800 engine. They'd been sent to England because 8 Fighter Command had been reporting problems with P-47 performance at altitude. Not failures, not crashes. Just a persistent sense that the aircraft weren't performing quite up to their potential. The Pratt & Whitney reps set up shop in one of the maintenance hangars and started talking to crew chiefs. Not lecturing. Listening. They wanted to know what the engines were doing in combat conditions versus test conditions, what pilots were experiencing, what mechanics were seeing during post-flight inspections. Pappy Gould was one of the crew chiefs they talked to, and during that conversation, something remarkable happened. The engineers didn't tell him he was wrong to want more power. They told him how to get it. The wastegate regulator, they explained, could be adjusted, carefully. The spring tension that determined when the wastegate opened could be increased, allowing the turbo to build higher boost before the valve cracked open to limit pressure. It wasn't officially authorized. It wasn't in any technical manual. But it worked. The engineers showed Gould and several other crew chiefs the adjustment procedure, how to access the regulator, which spring to tension, how much to turn the adjustment screw. A quarter turn might give you an extra 2 inches of boost. A half turn, maybe 4. More than that and you were asking for trouble. But within those limits, you could give pilots what they desperately needed. Power at altitude, when it mattered most. The engineers made one thing very clear. This was not an approved modification. If something went wrong, if an engine failed, if a pilot got hurt, Pratt & Whitney would deny any knowledge. This was mechanics working on their own initiative, taking responsibility for their own decisions. The company couldn't officially endorse it, but they also weren't going to stop it. Gould went back to Johnson's P-47 and made the adjustment. A quarter turn on the wastegate regulator spring. Small, conservative. Enough to see if the theory matched reality. Johnson flew the modified aircraft on a bomber escort mission to Brunswick 3 days later. At 28,000 feet, where he usually felt the Thunderbolt struggling to maintain formation speed, the engine pulled like it was 10,000 feet lower. Boost. Pressure held at 58 inches instead of 52. Not a huge difference. Just enough. Just that edge he'd been missing. Whatever Pappy did to my bird, we need to do it to every jug in the squadron. Within 2 weeks, Gould had adjusted the wastegate regulators on 16 P-47 seconds in the 61st Fighter Squadron. Other crew chiefs in the 56 Fighter Group heard about it and started making similar modifications. By early April, the practice had spread to multiple squadrons. Nobody talked about it officially. It wasn't in the maintenance logs. It wasn't reported up the chain of command. It was just something that mechanics did, quietly, in the spaces between official regulations and combat necessity. The pilots noticed immediately. Rate of climb at altitude improved by nearly 15%. Time to reach 30,000 feet dropped from 14 minutes to just under 12. More critically, once at altitude, the modified Thunderbolts maintained power output in the thin air, where unmodified aircraft felt lethargic. In a dogfight, that difference was life and death, but the modification wasn't without risks. Higher boost meant higher cylinder temperatures, more stress on connecting rods and bearings, increased likelihood of detonation if fuel quality varied. The R-2800 was a robust engine, built to absorb punishment, but there were limits. Gould and the other crew chiefs started paying close attention to spark plug condition, carbon fouling, signs of pre-ignition, unusual wear patterns on bearings during routine inspections. They were pushing the engines beyond their rated limits, and they needed to know when they'd pushed too far. The first potential disaster came in mid-April. A P-47 from the 62nd Fighter Squadron, one of the modified birds, returned from a mission with its engine running rough. Post-flight inspection revealed a cracked cylinder head on the number 7 cylinder. The crack was small, barely visible, but in another few hours of operation it would have propagated and possibly caused catastrophic failure. The pilot reported he'd been running high boost for an extended period during a running fight with FW-190AZs, 20 minutes at 59 inches of mercury. The engine had given him what he needed to survive, but it had paid a price. The incident forced the crew chiefs to establish informal rules. The modifications gave you more power, but you couldn't abuse it. Short bursts at high boost were fine. Extended operation required discipline. Most importantly, pilots and mechanics needed to communicate. If you pushed the engine hard, you told your crew chief. If the crew chief saw concerning wear patterns, you backed off. It was an unspoken contract. The mechanics gave the pilots tools to survive. The pilots had to use those tools responsibly. The spring and summer of 1944 validated the modification in ways nobody could ignore. The 56 Fighter Group, flying modified P-47 seconds, started racking up kill ratios that made other units jealous. In May, they claimed 42 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 3 Thunderbolts to aerial combat. In June, during the Normandy invasion, their modified jugs provided high-altitude cover for the invasion fleet, operating at 35,000 feet where their boost advantage gave them complete dominance. No German interceptor got through them to reach the transports below. Other fighter groups noticed. The 56th was getting results that couldn't be explained by pilot skill alone. Word spread through the informal network that connects maintainers across any military organization. Crew chiefs talked to crew chiefs. Technical representatives from Pratt & Whitney quietly visited other bases. By July, hundreds of P-47 seconds across 8th Fighter Command had been modified. The practice had gone from a handful of aircraft to becoming standard, operating procedure, all without ever appearing in a single official technical order. The establishment's reaction was complicated. Republic Aviation's engineers at Farmingdale heard rumours about field modifications and didn't know whether to be impressed or horrified. On one hand, mechanics were validating design capabilities that Republic had been too conservative to officially claim. On the other hand, warranties existed for a reason, and unsupervised modifications could lead to catastrophic failures that would reflect badly on the company. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, found himself in an awkward position. He knew his mechanics were exceeding official specifications. He also knew his pilots were coming home alive at rates that other groups couldn't match. When 8 Fighter Command Headquarters asked him directly about performance improvements in his unit, Zemke gave them an answer that was technically true and completely misleading. "Our maintenance crews are exceptionally diligent about engine care and aircraft preparation," he said, which was accurate. He just didn't mention what that diligence included. The truth was, by summer 1944, so many P-47 seconds had been modified that trying to reverse the practice would have been impossible. You can't put that particular genie back in the bottle. The modifications had proven themselves in the most demanding laboratory possible. Combat. Pilots trusted them. Crew chiefs perfected them. And the results spoke for themselves in after-action reports that showed modified Thunderbolts consistently outperforming their rated specifications. But the real validation came from an unexpected source: the Luftwaffe. German intelligence officers interrogating captured American pilots in mid-1944 started hearing consistent reports about P-47 performance that didn't match their intelligence estimates. The Thunderbolt was supposed to struggle above 30,000 feet. It was heavy, they'd been told. Adequate at high altitude, but not dominant. Yet German fighter pilots were reporting something different. P-47 seconds that climbed like they weighed 3,000 pounds less. Thunderbolts that held speed at 35,000 feet like they were at 20,000. Acceleration in the vertical that shouldn't have been possible for such a large aircraft. One Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated after being shot down in June, told his captors that he'd tried to escape a P-47 by climbing to 38,000 feet, where his Bf-109G normally had an advantage. The Thunderbolt not only followed him but was gaining. He'd pushed his Daimler-Benz 605 engine to emergency power, pulling every bit of boost his mechanical supercharger could provide. The P-47 stayed with him effortlessly. At 39,000 feet, the Messerschmitt's engine finally gave up, power dropping to less than 500 horsepower. The P-47 closed the distance and put a 2-second burst into his engine. He barely made it out of the aircraft before it exploded. The German pilot's report made it to Luftwaffe headquarters, where analysts tried to reconcile what they were hearing with what they knew about American engines. Their conclusion was that the Americans must have developed a new variant of the P-47 with a more powerful engine. They were half right. The engines were the same. The mechanics had just figured out how to make them give more than Republic had ever asked them to deliver. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The modification also changed tactical doctrine. Before spring 1944, P-47 seconds typically escorted bombers at the same altitude or slightly above, around 26 to 28,000 feet. The modified birds allowed a different approach. Flight leaders started positioning their formations at 32 to 35,000 feet, well above the bomber stream. From that altitude, they had enormous positional advantage. Any German fighter trying to reach the bombers had to climb through an altitude band where modified Thunderbolts had complete energy dominance. Major Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group pioneered the tactic. In August 1944, he led his squadron on an escort mission to Mersburg, one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition. Johnson took his 16 modified P-47 seconds to 38,000 feet and waited. The German fighters appeared right on schedule. 60-plus Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs climbing to attack the bombers at 26,000 feet. Johnson waited until the Germans were committed to their attack vector, engines screaming at full power, then rolled his formation into a diving attack. The math of energy warfare is brutal. Johnson's Thunderbolt started with 12,000 feet of altitude advantage, which converted to massive kinetic energy in the dive. They hit the German formation at over 500 miles per hour, tearing through it like bowling balls through pins. 8 German fighters went down in the first pass. The survivors scattered, trying to escape, but the modified P-47 seconds could climb back to altitude faster than the German fighters could run. 3 more fell on the second pass. Not a single bomber was lost. Johnson's after-action report was carefully worded. Aircraft performance at high altitude exceeded expectations, allowing superior positioning and engagement flexibility. He didn't explain how or why. He didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. The tactical advantage was so pronounced that other groups started requesting modified P-47 seconds. But you couldn't just requisition a modification that didn't officially exist. The knowledge had to spread pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic, through the informal networks that connected units. A crew chief from the 56th would visit another base, have drinks with their maintenance people, and casually mention some adjustments that seemed to help. Technical representatives from Pratt & Whitney kept making rounds, having quiet conversations, showing people spring tensions and adjustment procedures without ever putting anything in writing. By September 1944, an estimated 800 P-47 seconds in the European theatre had been modified. Not all of them were adjusted the same way. Some crew chiefs were conservative, adding just a quarter turn to the wastegate spring. Others were more aggressive, pushing boost pressures to 62 inches or higher. A few cowboys tried to take it even further and learned painful lessons when engines failed catastrophically. A P-47 from the 352nd Fighter Group lost its number 3 cylinder entirely, at 32,000 feet, the cylinder head separating from the barrel and punching, through the cowling. The pilot made it home on the remaining 17 cylinders, but the incident reminded everyone that there were limits. The really interesting thing about the modification was how it revealed gaps in official testing. Republic Aviation had test-flown the P-47 extensively at altitude. They'd mapped its performance envelope, but all those tests were conducted at specific power settings, for specific durations, following specific procedures. The engineers had been conservative, because that's what good engineers do. They build in safety margins. They assume worst-case scenarios. They protect against liability. But combat pilots don't have the luxury of safety margins. When a German fighter is trying to kill you, you use every bit of performance the aircraft can give, and you accept the risks that come with it. The modifications didn't change what the engine was capable of. They just removed the conservative limitations that prevented pilots from accessing that capability. Pappy Gould never received any official recognition for his role. His name appears in exactly 0 official documents, but Captain Robert Johnson, who became one of the top American aces in Europe with 27 confirmed kills, credited his crew chief repeatedly in interviews after the war. "Pappy gave me an edge," Johnson said. "Not a huge edge, just enough. In a dogfight, just enough is everything." Johnson's P-47, the one Gould maintained and modified, was named Lucky. By spring 1945, it had survived 200-plus combat missions without a mechanical failure. Other pilots requested it by tail number when Johnson rotated home. The ultimate vindication came from Republic Aviation itself. In late 1944, the company released the P-47M, a hot rod variant designed specifically for high-altitude interception of German jets. The model featured an upgraded R2-857 engine and an improved turbo supercharger. But the really telling detail was in the technical specifications: rated boost pressure, 60 inches of mercury. Republic's engineers had taken the lessons from field modifications and incorporated them into official design. They'd moved the goalposts. What mechanics had been doing unofficially for months became the new standard. The company never admitted that field modifications had influenced the model's specifications, but the crew chiefs who'd been tweaking wastegate regulators since spring knew the truth. The P-47M entered service with the 56th Fighter Group in January 1945. It was the fastest production Thunderbolt ever built, capable of 473 miles per hour at 32,000 feet. The pilots who'd been flying modified D models tested the new birds and came back with mixed reactions. "It's faster," one pilot reported, "but my old bird with Pappy's adjustments felt just as good at altitude. Maybe better, because I knew exactly how it would respond." There's a lesson in that. Sometimes the best engineering isn't about designing something new. It's about removing unnecessary restrictions from what already exists. The 56 Fighter Group shot down 7 German Me-262 jets in early 1945, all while flying P-47 seconds. The jet fighter was supposed to be untouchable, capable of speeds that piston-engine aircraft couldn't match. But speed isn't everything. The modified Thunderbolts had altitude advantage and could dive fast enough to intercept jets during their attack runs on bomber formations. Once the jet pilot committed to an attack, he couldn't easily escape. The P-47 would be waiting at the top of his escape climb, having used its superior high-altitude performance to position for the kill. Lieutenant Walter Szabo got one of those jet kills on April 10, 1945. His modified P-47M caught an Me-262 during its attack run on a formation of B-17 seconds. The German pilot never expected to see a Thunderbolt at 41,000 feet, matching his speed, guns tracking smoothly. Szabo put a 3-second burst into the jet's engine. The Jumo turbine disintegrated, and the 262 tumbled out of the sky. Szabo's crew chief had adjusted his wastegate regulator the night before. 3/4 turn. Aggressive by the standards they'd developed. But it gave Szabo just enough extra power to make the intercept. The jet pilot probably died wondering how a piston-engine fighter had caught him at that altitude. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the line between official specifications and field modifications had blurred completely. Republic's engineering department had quietly updated maintenance manuals to include alternative boost pressure settings for combat operations. The language was vague enough to provide legal cover, while acknowledging what everyone already knew. Mechanics had been exceeding rated limits for over a year, and it had worked. The accidents that engineers feared hadn't materialized. The engines proved more robust than conservative testing had suggested. And hundreds of pilots came home because their aircraft performed better than the enemy expected. Post-war analysis revealed something that surprised even the most experienced crew chiefs. The modified engines didn't fail at higher rates than unmodified ones. In fact, combat-driven failures, engines that quit due to battle damage or component fatigue, were slightly lower in modified aircraft. The theory, never officially proven, was that the higher boost pressures actually cleared carbon deposits more effectively, leading to cleaner combustion and less build-up over time. Or maybe pilots who knew they had extra power available used it more judiciously, running their engines in better operating ranges most of the time. Either way, the data undermined every conservative assumption that had led to the original limitations. The broader legacy is about trust. Trust between pilots and mechanics. Trust that field experience matters as much as engineering calculations. Trust that the people closest to the hardware often understand its capabilities better than the people who designed it. Pappy Gould wasn't an engineer. He'd never seen the inside of a wind tunnel. He couldn't calculate compressor efficiency or turbine blade loading, but he could listen to an engine, feel how it responded, and understand when it was being held back by rules rather than physics. Modern military aviation has institutionalized some of what those World War II crew chiefs taught us. There are now formal processes for field modifications, rapid testing programs, and feedback loops that allow frontline experience to influence design specifications. But even today, the best innovations often start the same way. Someone close to the hardware notices something everyone else missed and has the nerve to try a fix that isn't in the manual. The P-47 Thunderbolt ended World War II with a distinguished combat record. Over 15,000 built, more than any other American fighter, 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat. Over 7,000 German aircraft destroyed. That legacy owes something to Alexander Kartvel's brilliant design, something to Pratt & Whitney's robust engine, and something to thousands of pilots who fought in it. But it also owes something to crew chiefs like Pappy Gould, who looked at a wastegate regulator and asked the most dangerous question in engineering. What if? The P-47's ability to fight effectively at 42,000 feet wasn't just about the turbo supercharger system Republic built. It was about mechanics who understood that design specifications are starting points, not limits. It was about being willing to push boundaries when lives depended on it. And it was about having the courage to ignore the manual when the manual was wrong. That staff sergeant with grease under his fingernails never made it into the history books by name. But every P-47 pilot who fought at extreme altitude, who climbed faster than the enemy expected, who came home because their engine gave them that extra edge, knew. They knew that somewhere between official regulations and combat reality, a mechanic had decided that good enough wasn't good enough, and he'd done something about it. The modification didn't change the laws of physics. The R2800 engine always had that power potential. The turbo supercharger always could produce more boost. But it took mechanics, not engineers, to actually unleash it, because engineers build for liability and specifications and acceptable risk. Mechanics build for pilots they drink with, fly with, and bury when things go wrong. That difference in perspective, that willingness to take personal responsibility for bending the rules, saved lives that regulations would have sacrificed to caution. By war's end, the unofficial became official, the forbidden became standard, and the P-47's performance envelope expanded because someone had the guts to turn a spring adjustment screw 1/4 turn more than the manual allowed. Sometimes the most important innovations don't come from the top down. They come from the bottom up, written in grease pencil and proven in blood. That mechanic never knew how many lives his work saved or how far his idea rippled through aviation history. But every P-47 pilot who made it home from 40,000 feet knew. And that's the only recognition that really matters. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.